Hello there, and welcome to Dream Past Diaries. I'm truly glad you've made it here. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe you're the kind of dreamer who prefers to drift off to the sound of quiet thoughts and forgotten mysteries instead of counting sheep. Either way, tonight's story is yours to enjoy. You don't have to do anything now, just rest. Let your thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and your body grow lighter, as if gravity itself has begun to fade away. In the long and wandering corridors of early medieval memory, where the slow rhythm of centuries passes like the gentle lapping of cold northern waves against wooden hulls, the question of how Vikings kept themselves warm aboard their ships on the icy seas becomes less a mystery of technological innovation and more a gentle unfolding of small, quiet customs that belonged to a world where life moved at the pace of wind and water, and where warmth was not simply a matter of sparks and flames, but rather a collection of soft habits, fabrics, companionships, and understandings of nature, so that when one thinks of a Viking ship drifting across the dark winter horizon, it becomes possible to imagine the men not as warriors aflame with battle fury, but as calm, tired travelers wrapped in an assortment of furs and woven linens that held within them the faint, slower-attained heat of their own bodies and the lingering aroma of hearth fires left long behind on distant shores. Because fire itself, though central to Norse life, was far too dangerous to be used openly on a vessel carved from pitch-sealed planks and tarred beams. And thus the Vikings developed a kind of patient, deliberate relationship with the cold, learning not to fight it with the blaze of burning wood, but to soften its bite through layers, through shared body warmth, through simple and predictable routines that repeated each day with a kind of comforting monotony, so that the long hours at sea became filled with small movements rather than dramatic ones, such as tightening a cloak, rewrapping a woolen shawl, or adjusting the folds of a fur-lined hood. And these garments, sourced from sheep, goats, seals, and sometimes reindeer, were not merely pieces of clothing, but repositories of stories, inherited from older generations, patched carefully after long journeys, and steeped in the scent of lanolin, sea salt, and the slow accumulation of winters too numerous to count. While beneath these garments sat still more layer-soft inner shirts, made of loosely woven linen that brushed gently against chilled skin, thick tunics whose mute earth tones mirrored the color of northern soil, and outer cloaks fastened with brooches, whose metal grew cold to the touch, but which provided a reassuring weight across shoulders used to the burden of wind and weather. And as the ship creaked under the pressure of winter waters, the Vikings would often sit close to one another, their proximity a practical necessity rather than an act of sentiment. For body heat shared between quiet men staring out across the bleak horizon created a collective warmth far more reliable than any flame could offer aboard a vessel prone to rocking, listing, and sudden sprays of frigid seawater. And this habit, repeated hour after hour, allowed the cold to become not an enemy, but a companion whose presence was acknowledged, respected, and occasionally soothed by careful preparation. And indeed, the Vikings understood that warmth at sea began not upon the waves, but in the rituals of preparation on land, packing thick blankets woven by the women of their households, securing extra cloaks, storing sealed containers of hot broth prepared in the mornings before departure, and tucking warm stones into bundles that would retain their heat a little while into the early part of the voyage. And though these stones would eventually cool, their memory lingered in the cloths that wrapped them, providing a mild insulating effect that the men appreciated during the long hours when the sky darkened early and the horizon turned smoky with mist. And as the voyage stretched on, warmth was also sustained through movement, the gentle rhythm of rowing acting as a slow heating mechanism for muscles and blood, while those not rowing shifted their weight, rubbed their hands together, or tucked them beneath armpits, sleeves, or furs to maintain circulation. And these small gestures, so quiet, so repetitive, so deeply rooted in centuries of experience, had their own soothing cadence, so that life aboard a Viking ship in winter was not a tale of fighting frost, but of coexisting with it, of accepting that the cold was a constant presence, like a silent fellow traveler sitting nearby. And thus the Vikings would lean against shields hung along the ship's sides. These shields not only functioning as defense in hostile waters, but also forming a partial barrier against sea wind, creating narrow pockets in which warmth could collect and linger. And the men would sometimes rub beeswax or animal fat onto exposed portions of skin to create a protective layer. The scent of these substances, blending with the ever-present smell of brine, tar, and damp wood, a combination so distinctive that travelers who survived these voyages remembered it for the rest of their lives. And even food played a role in warmth. For though they could not cook at sea, they carried dried fish, dense bread, hard cheese, and fermented drinks. And these calorie-rich provisions sustained internal warmth, while occasionally they would pass around small leather pouches containing mildly spiced mead, a drink that, though not hot, brought a gentle internal glow that helped stave off the deeper shivers of winter travel. And when the night grew especially cold, the Vikings would shift their sleeping arrangements so that they lay closer together, sometimes using overlapping cloaks or sharing a single fur, understanding without needing to speak that warmth was a communal resource, not an individual one. And this quiet understanding formed an essential part of their maritime life, creating a ritual of mutual care that rarely appears in grand historical narratives, but which mattered greatly to the men experiencing these long journeys. And thus, when dawn arrived in pale shades of gray and blue, the crew would wake slowly, their breath forming small clouds that drifted upward into the cold morning air. And they would stretch stiff limbs, rewrap their layers, and begin again the gentle routine that defined their days. A routine so steady and uneventful that, paradoxically, it provided comfort, because nothing unexpected disturbed the measured pace of survival. And in this way, the Vikings learned that to stay warm aboard icy seas without fire was less about innovation and more about accepting the slow, rhythmic patterns of winter life, about finding warmth in layers, in closeness, in preparation, and in the understanding that the body itself, though small in the face of the vast northern cold, possessed a quiet, persistent heat capable of outlasting long nights upon the restless sea. In the slow, unhurried unfolding of Viking maritime life, the question of warmth aboard icy seas stretches far beyond the garments the sailors wore and reaches into the quiet, detailed world of ship construction itself. For the longships were not merely vessels of travel or war, but carefully crafted environments, whose structure influenced how cold was felt and managed. And so, when imagining the Vikings drifting steadily across a winter horizon, it becomes necessary to consider the gentle, persistent relationship between wood, wind, water, and the patient hands that shaped each plank, because the long ship was not built to be warm in a modern sense. Yet it possessed subtle features that softened the harshness of the northern climate in ways that feel almost invisible, unless one lingers upon them slowly, observing each tiny component as if walking a fingertip along the grain of aged oak. And the first of these features was the very material of the hull itself. For the Vikings typically constructed their ships from oak dense and naturally resistant to moisture, and over time the wood absorbed small amounts of seawater, which, rather than making the ship colder, created a stable internal temperature that changed gradually rather than sharply, preventing the kind of sudden chill that might otherwise seep into the bones of those aboard and the shipbuilders. Working patiently in coastal workshops, surrounded by salt air and the distant cries of seabirds, would shape each plank using ADSs, axes, and an intimate knowledge of the tree's character, allowing the wood to curve gently, almost like the ribs of a living creature. And these curves, once sealed together with tar and woolen caulking, created narrow pockets of trapped air between layers, which acted as simple but effective insulation. Not enough to create warmth as we might imagine it, but enough to slow the intrusion of winter cold, so that inside the vessel the temperature differed subtly, almost imperceptibly, from the raw bite of the open sea breeze. And although such differences were small to a Viking sailor who spent months surrounded by frost and spray, these subtle reductions in chill mattered greatly, providing a faint but reliable sense of enclosure, of something like shelter, even though no walls or roof protected them from the sky. And the tar used to seal the seams thick, dark, and sticky also played a quiet role in preserving warmth. For heated during application and then slowly cooling, it left behind not just waterproofing, but a dense, aromatic coating whose mass helped block wind and moisture, allowing the ship's interior surfaces to retain a stable feel beneath the hands that brushed against them during long hours of rowing or resting. And in the evenings, when the crew settled into their places along the benches, the hull's subtle insulation and the warmth of their bodies combined to create a faint cocoon-like environment, so gentle and understated that it might easily be overlooked by outsiders, but deeply familiar to those who lived upon these waters. And the shields hung along the ship's sides contributed to forming an extra barrier layer that caught and disrupted wind, transforming biting gusts into softer currents that filtered through the slight spaces between shield rims and hull planks. And because the shields were made of linden woodlighter, more flexible, and less heat-conductive than oak, they added a secondary wall that reduced exposure to direct wind, while also creating narrow pockets of trapped air, where the crew could draw marginal comfort, especially those sitting nearest the sides, who often leaned back against the shields not only for support, but to catch whatever shelter they provided. And during long voyages, these shields remained in place for days, their leather straps creaking faintly whenever the ship shifted. the sound blending with the low murmur of waves slapping gently against the hull, creating a steady rhythm that sailors learned to associate with the quiet endurance of cold weather. And beneath the benches, small storage compartments held bundles of spare cloth, folded sails, rope coils, and other supplies which, though never intended as insulation, inadvertently trapped heat below where the men's feet rested. The thick wool of the folded sailcloth especially acting as a muted, unintentional buffer against the cold rising from the boards. And when night fell and the rowing ceased, the men would sometimes place their cloaks or extra fur layers atop these storage bundles, using them as makeshift cushions that preserved warmth in a slow, gentle way. And because Viking ships lacked cabins or enclosed shelters except on larger vessels built later in the Norse era, the men understood that maintaining warmth was a collective and structural affair, involving not only what they wore, but how they placed themselves upon the ship, how they leaned into sheltered areas, how they arranged storage, and how they shielded their bodies from the harshest drafts by positioning themselves strategically, so that warmth became a matter of arrangement rather than invention. And even the oars, long and polished from use, played an understated role, for when they rested inside the ship rather than extended into the water, they added another layer of wooden mass that helped break wind at ankle and knee level. And though this contribution was tiny, the Vikings, who lived in a world where every subtlety mattered, surely felt these differences in quiet, unspoken ways. And over this physical structure lay another layer of warmth, the ship's rhythm. For warmth in their world was not only thermal, but also temporal, coming from the steady repetition of tasks, the predictable rise and fall of effort, the regularity of rowing that kept muscles warm and prevented stagnation. And when rowing stopped for long periods, the men instinctively rose, stretched, shifted positions, or adjusted their layers, knowing that stillness invited cold more swiftly than anything else. And because they learned from youth how cold behaved upon the sea, they carried an almost intuitive sense of how long they could sit before stiffness crept into their limbs, and how to prevent cold from settling too deeply into their bones. And so their habits became methodical, repetitive, and soothing. Pull the cloak tighter, check the shield's position, adjust the blanket beneath, shift closer to a companion, rub warmth into fingers, stretch shoulders, breathe into cupped hands. Motions performed countless times across a journey, forming a gentle choreography of survival that never broke into urgency or haste, but flowed softly from moment to moment, mirroring the calm persistence of the sea itself. And even the ship's slow rocking contributed to warmth, for the constant movement prevented the kind of deep stillness in which cold sinks most heavily. And while the rocking was sometimes tiring, it also maintained a sense of life and motion that kept the men's bodies subtly active, each minor adjustment helping maintain circulation. And over days and weeks, this slow, physical harmony between wood, wind, and human presence created an environment that, though cold by modern standards, felt stable, familiar, and quietly tolerable to those who lived within it. And thus, the warmth aboard a Viking ship was not a blaze, not a hearth, not a sudden burst of heat, but rather a slow, persistent network of factors: craftsmanship, arrangement, habit, rhythm that together formed a gentle resistance to winter's bite. a resistance so understated that one must look very closely, almost dreamily, to appreciate how each small detail contributed to the greater whole, offering a steady, muted comfort to sailors drifting across vast, icy seas. In the long, drowsy landscape of Viking seafaring life, where days stretched across muted horizons and the cold lingered like a familiar presence rather than an adversary, warmth aboard icy waters depended not only on clothing and ship structure, but also on the slow, methodical rituals of daily maintenance that shaped the atmosphere of the voyage. For the Vikings understood that comfort at sea was not something that emerged suddenly, but something cultivated gradually through routines so repetitive and gentle that they took on a hypnotic quality, the kind that softened the mind and lulled the senses. And so one can imagine the crew rising in the dim early light, their breaths forming pale clouds that drifted upward, then dissolved into the cold morning air, as each man, stiff from the night's chill, reached for familiar tasks that anchored them in warmth, such as shaking out their cloaks, brushing frost from wool, and adjusting the layered garments that clung to their bodies like muted shields against winter. And these early rituals, though simple, were carried out with great care. For after hours of lying close together, sometimes curled against shields or bundled beneath overlapping furs, their clothing needed shaking, smoothing, and tightening, since the smallest shift in fabric could mean the difference between comfort and the slow creep of cold along the spine. And once their cloaks were settled, the crew would engage in quiet acts of maintenance, checking their boots lined with fur or felted wool, inspecting the bindings on their trousers, rewrapping strips of cloth used as makeshift leg warmers, and sometimes rubbing tallow or rendered fat onto the exposed portions of their footwear to create temporary waterproofing that provided no heat of its own, but preserved dryness, a precious form of warmth in a place where moisture was relentless. And while these preparations happened, the men often spoke little, their thoughts drifting like the mist over the sea, because the rhythm of the tasks required no discussion and had been learned gradually from childhood, passed down through generations that lived closely with the sea's temperament. And after dressing, the crew would move on to inspecting their sleeping arrangements, folding the furs used during the night, shaking out blankets that had grown damp from condensation, and laying them loosely across benches or shield edges so the rising sun, faint though it was, could brush away the lingering wetness. For dry furs held warmth better, and the Vikings valued this small advantage greatly. And throughout these motions, the sound of gently rustling fabrics, the soft thud of boots shifting on wooden planks, the quiet creaking of tarred hullboards expanding against the cold all, monotonous soundscape that encouraged calmness rather than alertness, creating the kind of environment where the mind drifted and the body remained steady. And once these small chores were completed, the crew would distribute portions of food, typically dried fish or hard bread. And while these were not warm meals, the act of chewing, swallowing, and stimulating the body after a night's stillness created a mild, internal warmth that the men recognized, even if they seldom discussed it. And the simplest foods felt grounding and predictable, offering comfort in their constancy. And as they ate, some of the sailors would warm their hands by holding them beneath their cloaks against the heat of their own chests, a method so ordinary that it is easy to overlook its importance. For the human body itself was the most consistent source of warmth aboard the ship, and the Vikings treated it as such, not wasting energy on wishing for fire, but instead tending diligently to their own internal heat, preserving it through posture, movement, and the careful management of layers. And once the minimal breakfast was done, the next phase of the morning ritual began, centered on the maintenance of the ship. Because a well-kept longship preserved warmth indirectly by preventing drafts, leaks, and unnecessary exposure to wind, and so the men would check the seams where caulking might loosen, tapping gently with small hammers and applying tar where needed, the scent rising thick and familiar, mingling with the crisp bite of sea air. And this combination created a distinct atmosphere that seasoned sailors found oddly comforting. For the smell of tar meant safety, dryness, and the promise that the ship would hold firm through the coming hours. And while some checked seams, others inspected ropes, ensuring they remained supple rather than stiff with frost, as stiff ropes could snap or create sudden movements that exposed the crew to gusts of cold wind. So they handled each rope with slow, deliberate motions, warming it between gloved or calloused hands until flexibility returned. And these small acts of preservation, repeated day after day, became part of the ship's gentle rhythm, reinforcing stability and reinforcing warmth in ways so indirect that they seem almost poetic in their slowness. And when the oars were finally lowered again into the dark, rippling water, the rowing that followed brought its own soft heat, not a fierce or sudden warmth, but a gradual one that flowed through muscles and into bones, building slowly with each steady pull. And those not rowing would sit in the sheltered spots they learned to prefer behind shield clusters, beside storage bundles, or near the ship's central beam where wind was weakest. And they would wrap their cloaks tightly while rocking with the motion of the sea, allowing body warmth to slowly accumulate beneath thick layers of wool, linen, and fur. And over time, the combination of these daily rituals, dressing, shaking out furs, maintaining dryness, performing ship upkeep, rowing, and managing posture, formed a steady cycle. One that transformed the cold from something sharp into something dull, something known, something to be managed rather than feared. And because the Vikings were intimately familiar with the nature of northern weather, they leaned into these rhythms with a kind of quiet acceptance, trusting that warmth was not a single moment of heat, but a collection of small, patient actions spread across the day. And so their voyages continued in long stretches of monotony, the kind that slowly settles over the mind like a blanket, where nothing is urgent, where every task is performed slowly, where the cold itself becomes a backdrop rather than a threat. And in this way, the rituals of daily ship life became their own form of comfort, their own steady warmth against the sweeping frost of the open northern sea. As the Viking longship drifted through the slow, rhythmic expanse of the northern seas, the matter of warmth became not only a concern of physical preservation, but also a quiet, almost meditative extension of their cultural habits. And in this way, Chapter 4 turns toward the soft, understated realm of communal practices, those gentle, repetitive customs that filled the long hours and helped the crew maintain a sense of inner warmth that was as much emotional as it was bodily. For the Vikings understood that comfort during winter voyages was a layered experience, shaped not only by garments and shipcraft, but by the subtle interplay of companionship, memory, storytelling, and the calm acceptance of shared hardship. And so, as the ship glided steadily over gray waters that mirrored the sky in tone and temperament, the crew often found their warmth in the soft murmur of conversation, the quiet exchange of stories passed down through generations, spoken not in excitement, but in low, slow voices that carried no urgency, as if the telling itself were simply another way of warming the soul. And on particularly cold days, when frost settled on the shield rims and the oar handles grew slick with thin films of ice, the men would cluster slightly closer, forming small groups along the benches, their cloaks overlapping, their shoulders touching lightly, creating an unspoken sense of unity. And while this closeness offered physical heat, it also brought a calming reassurance, a reminder that no one faced the biting cold alone. And the Vikings, accustomed since youth to communal living, found this proximity natural and even comforting. For their longhouses at home were shared spaces where families, livestock, goods, and daily tasks often occupied the same warm interior. And though the ship was far less sheltered, the closeness it demanded felt familiar, invoking memories of hearthlit evenings during winter storms, when the crackling of fire mingled with the low hum of conversation. And these memories, though summoned silently, provided warmth in their own way, soothing the mind as the hours passed slowly over the open water. And within this gentle, communal setting, small acts of mutual care emerged quietly, without ceremony, repeated from instinct rather than instruction. For example, a man might carefully retie the leather thong securing another's cloak, preventing a gap where wind might slip through. Or one might share a small piece of dried fish with someone whose portion had fallen overboard. Or they might pass around a skin of mead, not for revelry, but for the faint internal glow it provided. And even the simple act of offering a better place to sit, one slightly more shielded from the wind, held meaning, for these gestures, though small, formed the invisible bonds that stitched their lives together, creating a warmth that could not be measured by temperature, but by familiarity and trust. And in the quiet isolation of the sea, such emotions became as essential as any cloak or fur, for they softened the psychological edge of winter voyaging, ensuring that the men drifted not into despair, but into a gentle, steady rhythm of coexistence with the cold. And these communal practices extended into the slow hours of midday, when rowing might pause for a stretch and the sea would lull the crew with its soft, repetitive movement. And during these breaks, the Vikings often occupied themselves with simple crafts or repairs, patching garments, tightening strap bindings, smoothing wooden handles, or rebraiding short lengths of rope. And these tasks, though mundane, kept their hands in motion long enough to maintain warmth, while also anchoring their minds in something steady and familiar. And those who were not crafting often occupied themselves with carving small designs into bits of wood or bone. Not elaborate pieces, but simple, repetitive patterns whose creation offered a calming, trance-like quality, well suited to the slow passing of time aboard the ship. And such carvings, made quietly and without haste, often became tokens carried home after the voyage, reminders of the long stretches of cold and the steady companionship that had carried them through. And the older sailors, who had experienced many winters at sea, sometimes used these hours to share soft-spoken wisdom, not dramatic tales of battle or storm, but quiet observations about weather patterns, the nature of ice, the behavior of seabirds, or the best ways to layer wool and fur for optimal warmth. And these instructions, offered in the low cadence of experience, blended into the overall atmosphere of gentle monotony, reinforcing the crew's shared understanding of survival in the cold. And as the afternoon wore on, the angle of the sun pale and hesitant during winter would shift subtly, casting longer, softer shadows across the deck, and the men would adjust their positions accordingly, seeking the spots that caught the faintest glimmers of warmth. And though sunlight in northern winters offered little heat, its presence held psychological value, brightening mood and creating the illusion of comfort even when the temperature remained bitter. And the Vikings appreciated these small illusions, treating them as natural gifts of the day. And when the sun began its early descent, the communal warmth intensified once more. For evening rituals brought the men physically and emotionally closer again, as they prepared for the long stretch of night by rearranging their sleeping spaces, shaking out furs, placing cloaks beneath them to block the cold of the wooden planks, and arranging their bodies in overlapping formations that shared warmth more efficiently. And though no fires burned on the ship, the layering of bodies, fabrics, and steady breaths created a cocoon of sorts, fragile yet reliable, sustained by repetition, instinct, and the enduring presence of companionship. And as the sky darkened into deep blues and muted purples, the soft sound of low conversation would fade, replaced by the gentle rhythm of waves and the occasional creak of the hull. And the men, wrapped in layers and warmed by their nearness, drifted into sleep slowly, their minds soothed by the monotony of the day and the knowledge that when morning came, they would wake into another cycle of shared habit, shared warmth, and the quiet, persistent endurance that defined their journeys across the icy northern sea. In the gentle, unhurried rhythm of Viking life upon the winter sea, where each day passed in a slow, almost dreamlike repetition of familiar tasks, the concept of warmth extended beyond clothing, ship structure, and companionship, gradually blending into the realm of food, though not food in the modern sense of comfort meals or warm dishes, but food as a quiet, sustaining ritual that offered subtle internal heat and emotional steadiness. And so, as the long ship continued its steady path across the icy northern waters, the crew relied on provisions chosen not for pleasure, but for their slow-release nourishment, their durability, and their ability to preserve the faint ember of warmth deep in the body. For the Vikings knew that what one ate on such voyages mattered greatly, not in flavor or variety, but in how well it supported their strength and calm over long stretches of cold silence. And thus, their stores consisted mostly of dried fish, salted meat, hardtack-like bread called flatbread, aged cheese, dense with fat, butter wrapped carefully in animal skin to protect it from seawater, and occasionally fermented or lightly spiced drinks, each portion measured not by abundance, but by necessity. And every meal, if it could even be called a meal, was consumed slowly, methodically, with the men often chewing in silence, as the wind brushed across their faces. The taste of salt and dryness mixing with the faint tang of brine in the air, creating a sensory monotony that mirrored the repeating waves around them. And though none of these foods provided warmth in the physical sense, their high fat and protein content helped maintain internal heat, a truth understood instinctively by these northern sailors long before the science of energy and metabolism existed. And so, in the early hours of the day, after shaking out their cloaks and stretching stiff limbs, they would eat a few bites of dried fish, soaking it briefly in a bit of seawater or mead to soften it, the texture resisting their teeth before yielding into small, salty fragments that provided enough energy to spark the faint warmth needed to begin rowing. And as the oars dipped into the cold water in a steady, rhythmic pattern, the subtle warmth from the food would mingle with the heat produced by movement, creating a slow-burning comfort that carried them through the morning. And when midday came, the men would take another brief break, distributing small portions of flatbread and cheese, the bread brittle and prone to snapping, its pieces falling like thin fragments of bark, while the cheese, often quite hard, required effort to cut or bite, and this very effort brought a sense of groundedness, as if the simple act of eating were a reminder of their connection to home, to the farms and dairies where such cheese was aged over many months. And even though the ship and the sea provided no warmth of their own, the memory of those homebound places, carried quietly within each preserved morsel, created a soft emotional heat that lingered in the mind, providing a warmth not felt by the skin but by the spirit. And sometimes, when the weather remained stable and the sea gentle, a small pouch of lightly fermented drink would be passed around, not in celebration but in calm necessity, for the faint alcohol content brought a mild flush to the face and chest, even if only temporary, and the Vikings valued this moment of internal warmth deeply, holding it as a small, transient comfort during the long, cold hours on the open water. And on certain days, when the weather grew harsher and the biting wind carried flakes of sea ice against the hull, the crew turned to their more nourishing provision sticker, strips of dried meat, small lumps of butter, or concentrated broths solidified into transportable lumps wrapped in cloth, and they would let these melt slowly in their mouths, allowing the dense fats to warm them from the inside out. For fat was the closest thing they had to fire at sea, a slow-burning fuel that kept their bodies resilient against the relentless cold. And though the men spoke little while eating, the act itself became something like a meditation, with each bite taken deliberately, each swallow followed by a pause, during which they listened to the gentle slap of water against the hull, the distant cry of seabirds, or the soft creaking of tarred planks. And this slow, mindful eating created a kind of inner stillness that worked alongside the food to preserve warmth, teaching their bodies and minds to endure the cold not by resisting it, but by accepting it with calm persistence. And in this sense, the meals aboard a Viking longship were not simply about survival, but about maintaining a steady emotional equilibrium, ensuring that the men drifted not into agitation, but into a peaceful, almost trance-like state, encouraged by repetition, quiet, and monotony. And when evening approached, the men would gather their provisions one last time, taking slightly larger portions to prepare for the long night ahead, knowing that the cold deepened once the sun dipped beneath the horizon. And they would allocate the richest food bits of cheese, small pieces of meat, a sip of mead to ensure their bodies stayed warm during the hours of stillness. For once they lay down beneath their shared layers of furs and cloaks. Movement decreased, and the body's natural heating diminished. And the Vikings, familiar with this nightly drop in temperature, prepared carefully for it, consuming their food slowly, savoring not the taste but the sensation of warmth that followed, however faint it might be. And as they finished, they would wrap their provisions tightly, protecting them from moisture, placing them back into storage with deliberate care. And then the ship would settle into its nightly silence, with the men lying close together, their stomachs filled just enough to keep warmth circulating through their limbs, their breaths forming soft clouds in the dimming air, their minds drifting into calm. Slow thoughts shaped by the gentle monotony of daily eating, a monotony that soothed rather than bored them, providing a predictable rhythm that anchored them against the vast, unpredictable cold of the northern sea. And thus, in the long, drifting world of Viking winter voyages, warmth was not only woven into cloaks or built into ships or shared among companions. It was consumed in small, steady portions, absorbed slowly, allowed to radiate inward at a pace that matched the gentle rocking of the boat, turning each bite into a quiet act of endurance, and each meal into a subtle ritual of warmth that carried them patiently through the long, icy days. It is in the quieter reflections of the later centuries, when the records of coastal monasteries grew thicker and the scribes became more accustomed to copying long, uneventful observations about passing ships and seasonal conditions, that one begins to see how the memory of Viking heating methods aboard their cold sea vessels shifted from a practical matter to a subject of gentle speculation and almost meditative curiosity. Because, as later scholars tried to reconstruct the routines of these long-gone seafarers, they often focused less on dramatic battles or towering storms and more on the subtle rhythms of life aboard the ships, especially during the lengthy winter voyages, when the absence of open fire forced the crews to rely on layers, shared warmth, and steady communal routines, creating a kind of slow, shared culture of endurance that was not defined by hardship, but by the gradual acceptance of cold as a companion rather than an enemy. And in these monastic commentaries, one repeatedly encounters the same kind of dreamy, meandering descriptions that emphasize the stillness of cold mornings on the sea, the quiet motion of the oars dipping through water, and the way the breath of the sailors drifted upward like pale fog, mingling with the moisture rolling off the sail. And when these scribes considered how the Vikings kept themselves warm without flame, they tended to drift into thoughtful explanations about the quality of woolen cloaks, the layered bindings of tunics, the way tightly woven sails could be repurposed as makeshift coverings during rest periods, and the almost ceremonial practice of huddling near stored provisions that had themselves retained a faint ambient warmth from their packing before departure, a warmth that was not dramatic or comforting in the usual sense, but was present, enough to create a quiet psychological reassurance, as though the food and equipment were silent companions, offering what little heat they could. And through these commentaries, one can picture the sailors adjusting slowly to the cold rather than resisting it, drawing comfort from the predictable patterns of the voyage, in which every morning was similar to the one before. Every evening carried the same slow descent into dim light, and every night was shaped by the gentle rocking of the ship that became its own form of warmth. Not literal heat, but the calming familiarity of motion that distracted the mind from the sharpness of the chill. And the monks writing about them several generations later would often remark on this peculiar kind of mental acclimation, describing it as a soft discipline that developed over time until the cold ceased to sting and instead settled into the body as a steady, constant presence, like the weight of clothing or the pressure of boots. And they believed this slow acceptance was the reason the Vikings rarely attempted to make dangerous onboard fires, recognizing that their woolen garments, sheepskin wrappings, and oiled cloaks offered a far safer and ultimately more reliable source of warmth than flame ever could on a wooden vessel surrounded by saltwater winds. And these same records, drifting into almost poetic tedium, describe how the sailors would often lean against one another during long trips, not in an affectionate sense, but in a practical, habitual one, forming gentle lines of shared body heat, their shoulders touching, their cloaks overlapping to trap warm air in small pockets that traveled back and forth with each shift of weight. And this effect was strongest on the colder nights, when the crew would gather beneath stretched pieces of spare sailcloth, creating a kind of canvas canopy that shielded them from the direct bite of the wind and encouraged the pooled warmth of the huddled group to settle more evenly among them. And although this practice may seem simple, the monks treated it as a point of anthropological importance, describing it with lingering detail, as though every fold of fabric, every shifting posture, every shallow breath mattered in their attempt to explain how these mariners endured nights that would have driven untrained travelers into restless discomfort. And combined with the insulating effect of animal pelts packed around supplies, the wool-stuffed bedding rolls that acted as cushions and heat retainers, and the slow warming of the ship's interior planks through constant exposure to the crew's bodies, the overall environment of the Viking ship became a kind of gently moderated microclimate, still cold, still stark, but softened by the persistent accumulation of shared human heat. And the scribes, with their fondness for detailed observation, often wrote that the sound of the crew shifting and breathing together, along with the whispering rustle of their cloaks, created a quiet harmony that reminded them of communal monastic sleeping halls where brothers lay side by side in rows, seeking not comfort but unity with the rhythm of the night. And they noted that such quiet, repetitive, nearly motionless scenes seemed to define the Viking winters far more than any saga suggested, because while the stories of storms and raids were retold with dramatic flair, the reality of most voyages was marked by long stretches of sameness, an endless procession of cold mornings, pale horizons, damp wool, and the muted murmurs of men discussing trivial matters to pass the time, such as the texture of newly woven cloaks from their home settlements, the faint smell of lanolin that clung to their garments, the way the sea salted the edges of their sleeves until they stiffened, and how their boots grew warm only after several hours of walking or rowing. And the monk's fascination with these mundane details reveals their desire to capture not the heroism, but the stillness of these journeys, because to them, understanding how the Vikings endured the cold without fire was a way of understanding how people could adapt to the natural world through patience rather than force, through repetition rather than innovation, and through simple, cumulative habits rather than sudden acts of ingenuity. And so, Chapter 7 in this wandering historical reconstruction becomes less about new discoveries and more about the slow realization that the warmth aboard Viking ships was never a singular solution, but an ongoing weaving together of clothing, community, routine, and mental adjustment, creating a tapestry of quiet endurance that stretched across each voyage, binding the crew together in shared stillness beneath low gray skies and gently creaking timbers, where the absence of fire was not a deficiency, but simply another aspect of the sea's character, accepted without struggle and integrated into the soft, methodical rhythm of life afloat. It is in the quieter reflections of the later centuries, when the records of coastal monasteries grew thicker and the scribes became more accustomed to copying long, uneventful observations about passing ships and seasonal conditions, that one begins to see how the memory of Viking heating methods aboard their cold sea vessels shifted from a practical matter to a subject of gentle speculation and almost meditative curiosity. Because, as later scholars tried to reconstruct the routines of these long-gone seafarers, they often focused less on dramatic battles or towering storms, and more on the subtle rhythms of life aboard the ships, especially during the lengthy winter voyages, when the absence of open fire forced the crews to rely on layers, shared warmth, and steady communal routines, creating a kind of slow, shared culture of endurance that was not defined by hardship, but by the gradual acceptance of cold as a companion rather than an enemy. And in these monastic commentaries, one repeatedly encounters the same kind of dreamy, meandering descriptions that emphasize the stillness of cold mornings on the sea, the quiet motion of the oars dipping through water, and the way the breath of the sailors drifted upward like pale fog, mingling with the moisture rolling off the sail. And when these scribes considered how the Vikings kept themselves warm without flame, they tended to drift into thoughtful explanations about the quality of woolen cloaks, the layered bindings of tunics, the way tightly woven sails could be repurposed as makeshift coverings during rest periods, and the almost ceremonial practice of huddling near stored provisions that had themselves retained a faint ambient warmth from their packing before departure. A warmth that was not dramatic or comforting in the usual sense, but was present enough to create a quiet psychological reassurance, as though the food and equipment were silent companions, offering what little heat they could. And through these commentaries, one can picture the sailors adjusting slowly to the cold rather than resisting it, drawing comfort from the predictable patterns of the voyage, in which every morning was similar to the one before. Every evening carried the same slow descent into dim light, and every night was shaped by the gentle rocking of the ship that became its own form of warmth. Not literal heat, but the calming familiarity of motion that distracted the mind from the sharpness of the chill. And the monks writing about them several generations later would often remark on this peculiar kind of mental acclimation, describing it as a soft discipline that developed over time until the cold ceased to sting and instead settled into the body as a steady, constant presence, like the weight of clothing or the pressure of boots. And they believed this slow acceptance was the reason the Vikings rarely attempted to make dangerous onboard fires, recognizing that their woolen garments, sheepskin wrappings, and oiled cloaks offered a far safer and ultimately more reliable source of warmth than flame ever could on a wooden vessel surrounded by saltwater winds. And these same records, drifting into almost poetic tedium, describe how the sailors would often lean against one another during long trips, not in an affectionate sense, but in a practical, habitual one, forming gentle lines of shared body heat, their shoulders touching, their cloaks overlapping to trap warm air in small pockets that traveled back and forth with each shift of weight. And this effect was strongest on the colder nights, when the crew would gather beneath stretched pieces of spare sailcloth, creating a kind of canvas canopy that shielded them from the direct bite of the wind and encouraged the pooled warmth of the huddled group to settle more evenly among them. And although this practice may seem simple, the monks treated it as a point of anthropological importance, describing it with lingering detail as though every fold of fabric, every shifting posture, every shallow breath mattered in their attempt to explain how these mariners endured nights that would have driven untrained travelers into restless discomfort. And combined with the insulating effect of animal pelts packed around supplies, the wool-stuffed bedding rolls that acted as cushions and heat retainers, and the slow warming of the ship's interior planks through constant exposure to the crew's bodies, the overall environment of the Viking ship became a kind of gently moderated microclimate, still cold, still stark, but softened by the persistent accumulation of shared human heat. And the scribes, with their fondness for detailed observation, often wrote that the sound of the crew shifting and breathing together, along with the whispering rustle of their cloaks, created a quiet harmony that reminded them of communal monastic sleeping halls where brothers lay side by side in rows, seeking not comfort but unity with the rhythm of the night. And they noted that such quiet, repetitive, nearly motionless scenes seemed to define the Viking winters far more than any saga suggested. Because while the stories of storms and raids were retold with dramatic flair, the reality of most voyages was marked by long stretches of sameness, an endless procession of cold mornings, pale horizons, damp wool, and the muted murmurs of men discussing trivial matters to pass the time, such as the texture of newly woven cloaks from their home settlements, the faint smell of lanolin that clung to their garments, the way the sea salted the edges of their sleeves until they stiffened, and how their boots grew warm only after several hours of walking or rowing. And the monk's fascination with these mundane details reveals their desire to capture not the heroism but the stillness of these journeys, because to them, understanding how the Vikings endured the cold without fire was a way of understanding how people could adapt to the natural world through patience rather than force, through repetition rather than innovation, and through simple, cumulative habits rather than sudden acts of ingenuity. And so, Chapter 7, in this wandering historical reconstruction, becomes less about new discoveries and more about the slow realization that the warmth aboard Viking ships was never a singular solution, ongoing weaving together of clothing, community, routine, and mental adjustment, creating a tapestry of quiet endurance that stretched across each voyage, binding the crew together in shared stillness beneath low gray skies and gently creaking timbers, where the absence of fire was not a deficiency, but simply another aspect of the sea's character, accepted without struggle and integrated into the soft, methodical rhythm of life afloat. In the final contemplative stretch of this long and gentle exploration into how Vikings managed warmth upon their icy sea voyages without the use of open fire, it becomes clear that the real answer has always rested not in a single ingenious method or hidden technology, but in an entire quiet philosophy of endurance, one shaped gradually by generations of living in close relationship with cold climates. And as later historians, antiquarians, and monastic compilers sifted through the softened memories of that era, they tended to describe the seafaring Norse not as people who fought against the cold, but as those who wove it into their identity with a patient acceptance that seems almost meditative when considered from the warm comfort of modern rooms. For these chroniclers often wrote at length about the calm, deliberate way in which the Viking crews prepared for voyages, layering garments not for style or appearance, but for the steady insulation they provided, each layer adding only a small measure of warmth on its own, yet contributing to a stable, enduring system that required little adjustment during the long weeks at sea. And as these authors reviewed the artifacts preserved in burial sites and coastal settlements, they often described with repetitive, soothing precision the textures of the wool, the patterns of weaving, the lanolin-scented threads that resisted moisture, the thick seams that slowed the wind's intrusion, and the quiet labor of the women who spun and wove these garments back home, their slow and steady work forming an invisible connection between domestic hearths and the faraway decks of longships, where the same garments served as anchors of comfort. And in these gentle descriptions, one sees how the warmth aboard the ships was not an isolated circumstance, but part of a greater cultural rhythm. For the Vikings' concept of warmth extended beyond physical heat and entered the realm of psychological steadiness, where the predictability of routine, the familiar scratch of wool on the skin, and the soft murmur of companions resting nearby became calming constants against the vast uncertainty of the sea. And so the final picture drawn by these contemplative chroniclers is not merely of men enduring cold, but of men shaped by its presence, letting it settle into their bodies and minds until it became a background hum rather than a pressing discomfort. And this is perhaps why so many late medieval and early modern scholars writing about them tended to drift into slow, hypnotic prose when describing these voyages, lingering again and again on the same details, the way sailors rolled their cloaks into makeshift pillows, the way their breath misted faintly at dawn, the way their hands, numbed at first by the morning frost, slowly warmed through repetitive motion, and the way their eyes adjusted to the pale, washed-out colors of the winter horizon, where sea and sky blended in muted grays that were neither alarming nor inspiring, but simply present, like the steady hum of quiet breathing in a shared room. And as these scholars continued their dedicated, though often meandering efforts to reconstruct daily seaborne life, they frequently noted that the absence of fire on the ships created not a sense of loss, but a space for other forms of comfort. The comfort of listening to the slow creak of wooden beams expanding with the cold. The comfort of feeling the weight of layered clothing press gently against the chest. The comfort of predictable tasks that filled each day with familiar, unhurried motions, such as coiling ropes, maintaining sails, or inspecting or bindings. And the comfort of knowing that every man aboard was equally enveloped, the same shared quiet and the same shared sense of patient endurance, all of which combined to form a communal warmth far more stable than any flame could have offered in such conditions. And so, as the monastic authors reached the ends of their accounts, they often inserted soft reflections that the true warmth of the Viking ships lay not in heat, but in the calmness that grew from repetition, in the steady acceptance of environment, in the quiet discipline of dressing properly, and in the nearly monastic togetherness of crews who spent long nights side by side, listening to the dull tapping of sea against hull, feeling the gentle vibration of the wind against the sailcloth canopy, and finding in these rhythms a kind of meditative solace that transcended temperature, transforming the voyage into a drifting, timeless state of being, a liminal space where day and night blurred into one another, and where the cold became a companion rather than a threat. And if one imagines a final scene to encapsulate this, it would be the vision described by an anonymous chronicler who wrote that, at the quietest hour of the winter night, when even the sea seemed to still its restless heaving, the ship felt like a vast cradle carrying its sleeping crew across an endless gray expanse, the men resting under layers of wool and sailcloth, their breaths rising in soft, almost invisible wisps, their bodies aligned in unbroken rows like monks in a dormitory, and the cold pressing gently upon them like a cool hand that neither harmed nor comforted, reminding them of their place in the world. And so, Chapter 8, bringing this long, slow, almost dreamlike narrative to its close leaves, one with the understanding that the Vikings, in their quiet voyages across ice-rimmed seas, found warmth not through fire but through patience, preparation, and the soft, enduring strength of communal human presence. A warmth that lingers still in the calm, repetitive words of those who wrote about them centuries later, preserving not their battles or their storms, but their stillness, their acceptance, and the gentle rhythm by which they lived at sea.